Let's see. All right, so I think we'll get going. So I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Doug Herrick from the Acton Historical Society. And of course, we have Bill Klauer, the Acton historian, also member of the Historical Society. And what we wanted to do today was to give a presentation using our usual style of, back and forth and passing off the narrative between Bill and myself, to talk a little bit about the history of railroads in Acton, to talk about why there's so many railroads in Acton. Why are there 4 railroads within such a small town? And how did it really develop the town? So what we'll be doing is talking a little bit about how Acton, in terms of geology and transportation, was a very attractive place for railroads to come. In addition, the politics of many of the active members of Acton's government and business community in their lobbying for railroads, how they came to Acton. The 4 railroads we'll talk about are the Fitchburg Railroad, with stops in South and formerly West Acton, it used to stop. And we'll also talk about the East Acton railroads, which were the Nashua Acton and Boston, and the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail line, also known as the Framingham and Lowell. And there was a line that is now the Assabet River Rail Trail that went from South Acton down to Maynard, Hudson, and Southborough. And it's a great story. So just to begin here, if you look at the geology of Acton here, you'll see that the way it was formed as an extension of Concord back in 1635 and then became its own town in 1735, it was really essentially extended out from Concord because of the different meadows and grassland for grazing. It was blessed with very nice riverways in the form of the Neshoba Brook and the Fort Pond Brook. And as a result, there were some natural trails that developed, originally Native American trails on what is Route 2A and 111, and the old School Street, which later became early roads, stage lines, and then of course, because railroads naturally follow flat river valleys, the railroads came. Originally, although Acton Center was the center of government and the municipal center of Acton, the South Acton, also known as Mill Corner, because of the mills and the natural waterways and the power, was originally settled along with parts of the Neshoba Brook for different mills. Railroads were obviously very important in New England. And if you can, I like this map because it sort of shows how towns, although they may previously exist before the railroads, are really developed when a railroad comes in. You can see how these towns, clustered around different rail lines in terms of development and growth. It was absolutely critical for many farmers and businessmen to have a rail link. The benefits of railroad access were pretty obvious. If you needed to get anywhere, having a wagon or an ox cart to deliver things was a pretty rough way of moving produce and people. Clearly, a railroad, and earlier the canals, if you had access to, let's say, the Middlesex Canal, which predated the Lowell and Boston Railroad, to be able to move bulky items such as grain, agricultural produce, the output from different mills and industries was really critical. And the railroad both brought in items to sell and to use and shipped out items that had been pulled together either through agriculture or through business and manufacturing. And I'll let Bill talk a little bit about some of the agriculture and some of the early businesses that developed out of home industry that really permitted Acton to grow.
Thanks, Doug. Um, I think our earliest industry that we know of in Acton is a fulling mill, which is the located where Erickson's grain mill is. Fulling is the process of beating the wool in cloth to cover up all of the spaces in between, or it makes it fuller. So that is the earliest that we know about. It's uh, goes back to about 1702, and I don't know just how long it went, but the mill, everything is still there from the earliest mill. The dam is still there, and everything underground has been filled in now, but there's still enough down there to establish a pretty good idea of what the area was like. Later on, the water power was harnessed uh, when they came up with more efficient means of harnessing instead of overshot or undershot wheels. They went to turbines, and they were able to, with a turbine, you're able to make better use of the uh, available water power without a long drop in the water itself going over a wheel. So by the time the turbines came along, Acton had already started to develop, which meant that Fort Pond Brook was a likely candidate. Back in 1975, there was a pretty good fire down in South Acton that took out Erickson's grain mill. We didn't know it at the time, but after they cleaned off uh, the basement and everything else, there were two huge turbines down there, about 5 feet in diameter each, which took the water. And by the way, the water at Erickson's Dam went down both sides of the dam. It came down the front side and in front of the building and then dropped underneath. It was still there when I was a kid, and it was kept covered over with boards, but the sluiceway was there. It was about 4 feet deep. On the other side was the uh, equipment for the sawmill that had already been moved back around 1932. So um, that was probably our earliest use of turbines in South Acton. Uh, and I think we'll just keep going here.
Yeah.
There are other mills along the way.
Yes. And so in addition to the agricultural advantages of being able to ship out produce and bring in livestock, the employment was significant too. And we mentioned down at the bottom a few of the roles and positions that the railroad brought in with them. So just as some background, the earliest railroads came to Massachusetts in the early 1830s. You had the Boston and Lowell going north. That was obviously a planned community around mills, and they needed to transport what they were producing more efficiently than the Middlesex Canal could do it. And the Middlesex Canal obviously was frozen in the winter. So they chartered a railroad. The canal fought it, but the Boston and Lowell essentially was what was created. The Boston and Providence obviously went south with links to New York City, and the Boston and Worcester went west with links to Albany in the west. So Acton's merchants, didn't want to be left out of this. And when the Fitchburg line was discussed, they promoted Acton being part of that and being a stop along the railroad. Winthrop Faulkner, Bill just mentioned the Faulkner Mills in South Acton, and Daniel Weatherby, who had mills that we'll talk a little more about, where Bursaw's is in East Acton, were major promoters of the railroad. And Bradley Stone in West Acton obviously had a real estate business and was looking to develop that. So back then, in order to charter or to get permission to develop a railroad, you needed to have the legislature in Boston pass a bill. There was no means of developing charters until about 1872. So obviously each charter necessitated lobbying the legislators and getting a bill. And there was a lot of competition, and we'll discuss in a little bit some of the interesting machinations that went on in what was a sharp-elbowed political environment for who gets access to the railroad. We mentioned Daniel Weatherby, and he'll show up again. The eastern side where he lived was the Framingham Lowell and the Nashua Acton in Boston. He really was hoping to be able to go north and south without having to go through Boston. Everyone else on the Fitchburg line shipped through Boston and then north or south. Another East Acton proponent was someone named Eldridge Robbins. He had a huge dairy business and apple businesses. And obviously to ship cattle and that sort of bulk agriculture necessitated a railroad. So hopefully you can see the cursor here, the little pointer. In this map of Acton, down here going down to West Concord, you see the Framingham and Lowell and the Nashua Acton in Boston that would go up to North Acton, right around Route 27, Main Street. And at that point, the Framingham and Lowell branched off going north. That's the Bruce Freeman. Nashua Acton in Boston went up through Westford and Dunstable up to Nashua that way. Down here, you have the Fitchburg line stopping at South Acton, West Acton, and this line that we'll talk a little bit about also was the Marlborough line. So Fitchburg was the first railroad coming to Acton in 1842. It eventually extended its operations out, west through the Hoosac Tunnel, and it was a significant railroad for this area. One interesting area that I had to put this slide up. Rocky Guzzle, if anyone is familiar with this low land area or glen between Woodlawn Cemetery and the chapel, this was where they eventually, planned to bring the Fitchburg Railway through just south of Acton Center. And the folks living in Acton Center didn't want to have anything to do with it. This would have essentially gone a little bit south of Acton Center near Minot Street. It crosses Concord Road and then makes its way to Route 2 and then out to Littleton and Fitchburg. And it was opposed, and the folks that wanted West and South Acton naturally jumped in and made sure that it wouldn't go in that direction. We also have Concord Junction, which you're saying, why are you doing Concord Junction? It's in Concord. You'll see that it's the terminus for both the Nashua Acton in Boston, and it's crossed by the Framingham and Lowell. And there's a reformatory line that we'll talk about that leads to the old prison from Concord that also went through here. And it was an important station. But the most important station, and still the busiest station on the line, is South Acton. And let me try to orient you a little bit here with this map. I hope you can see it. You have the Fitchburg Railway coming from West Concord through South Acton, crossing Fort Pond. Bill just mentioned the Faulkner Mills that were right here. Here you can see the branch line for the Marlborough and Hudson coming down in what is now the Assabet River Rail Trail at the Fort Pond Brook Dam. And in this area here were some interesting turntables and engine rooms, the foundations of which you can still see. But this area up here were the two crossings. This is Main Street coming here with High Street breaking off. And then over here is the road to Stowe. Right now, it just essentially doesn't exist as a crossing anymore once the bridge went in. So I'm going to let Bill talk a little bit about South Acton and the station as we go through some of these slides here with Faulkner Mills on the left and some of the stations here.
Hey, there were a number of bad accidents along the railroad in South Acton over time. In fact, I've heard that there were over 40 deaths involved on the Fitchburg line. And it was finally decided to put in a bridge. It did not occur overnight, though. 1904, Percy Tuttle was killed crossing the South Acton Stowe, where the railroad crossed at Railroad Street and Stowe Street. He was driving a wagon, horse, and the horse and the cart survived. Percy was killed when he was thrown from his wagon. Anyway, that was supposedly the last death prior to the bridge being built. There were several things that had to go first, and it basically meant we had to close South Square because the original 1840s train station, the lubrication house, and everything was right in the middle of where the bridge is today. So first off, that stuff all had to be moved out. They had to secure land and plan it out. So this happened over a couple of years, and finally we got what we have there today. But if you look at this thing that was created down there, it was for its time a fairly simple design. However, it was also complicated by the number of tracks.
Yeah, I'll just I'll just show this. So this is looking, if you were before the bridge that Bill mentioned, Main Street basically went right through here. This is Exchange Hall here. You can see over here where Exchange Hall is right here. So essentially this photo right here was taken about right here. Off to the right are the Faulkner Mills, the sawmills, and you can see the Marlborough Branch coming in. I think on the left here, Bill, was this was Stowe Street, right? And then
No,
going up Main Street?
no, that is Main Street and Maple Street on the upper left.
Okay.
Lower right is the crossing of Railroad Street and Stowe Street. If you look at these two pictures, you can see the number of tracks that were there. And this is what made the crossing complicated and dangerous, is the fact that we had multiple gates and gatehouses, and this is the Marlborough Branch had pretty well broken off by the lower right-hand picture, and in the upper picture, you're standing on the tracks for the Marlborough Branch.
Right.
So it
and
was
one of the interesting things to jump in is that when the streetcars first started coming up from Maynard, they couldn't get across here. So basically they followed Main Street up and couldn't get past these tracks. So I think they eventually went south of the tracks over to West Acton, and that was as far as they could get. Otherwise, you would have to cross over these things and then pick up the streetcar north of these tracks.
And that's just what they did. They kept a car on the other side, and you could get off the streetcar in South Acton, walk across the tracks, and get on the waiting car to go over to West Acton. So it was kind of an awkward mess. Here is the bridge under construction to the left, at lower left, and to the right um, at the completed bridge in 1906. Above is an engine with a load of stone in the back, which is being brought to the site to build up the two abutments for the bridge. Actually, there were three abutments. There was the Marlborough Branch went between them, and it was Marlborough was eliminated when they rebuilt the bridge in the 1990s. South Acton Station. There's been three stations there. The one that's there today is obviously the latest. This is the 1892 train station, which was closed, sold to a guy by the name of Perazzo, and it eventually caught fire because they were doing welding inside, which the building wasn't designed for. He was using his kid was using it for a repair garage, and wasn't exactly fireproof. And there's the station today, as we know it.
Right. So I guess for a while, all they got, this was before me, but there was nothing but an asphalt platform, you know. So I guess you'd stand out there in the rain and just wait for the trains.
After the station burned, there was a lot of dilemma in town about what to do with it, and somebody suggested that we put a cable around the thing and go to the opposite side of the track and let the next engine going through take it away. And
so I'll jump in here. This is an interesting story of how the Marlborough Branch started out. Originally, some businessmen picked up a charter from the state to create a railroad called the Lancaster and Sterling, and that was going to essentially branch off from South Acton and go out to Sterling and then Lancaster. And the owners of the Fitchburg Railway did not want to lose traffic to this branch line. So somehow politically they managed to take control, either by buying up, you know, a majority of the stock or getting their friends in the legislature to give them control. And they changed the charter. So instead it went down to Hudson and Marlborough. And then they eventually acquired the whole thing. But it was an interesting power grab. And this connected the South Acton Station and all those points with the Massachusetts Central that went from Boston out to Northampton. So that was an interesting connection of services. And I'll let Bill explain what this photo is of some of the Marlborough Branch buildings there.
okay, previous to which, between South Acton and where Marlborough Branch, Central Mass went through, were some decent industries. The American Woolen Company in Maynard, which had been founded in the 1840s, eventually became the largest wool producer in the United States by 1900. And this is the one line that served them. So this became a very popular area. Down in Gleasondale, the Gleason family owned another mill still standing right at what is called Rock Bottom. They manufactured woolen cloth as well. So it was a good area to get into. Down in Hudson was the town of Feltonville, which manufactured leather boots and stuff. So we had some decent industries. Above between the two tracks, right in the very middle, you can see a pair of ball type objects hanging there. And the one which was the higher gave you an indication, if you were driving an engine, which one had the right of way, and that's what they called highballing it. So in this particular case, they are at the exact same height, which meant that any engineer coming through had to use caution. The other thing is there were 9 sets of tracks at Acton that I know about, and this involved a lot of people to operate all of the gates. Along the Marlborough Branch, you can see on the left-hand side the remains of the turntable and the engine house. And it was, like I said, it was a very popular branch, and you could get from Central Mass up to Boston, or you could go from Fitchburg down to Central Mass. And I'm not too sure about the rights of the different companies that own these things, but they seem to survive and profit. This is a interesting photograph of the Marlborough Branch. The buildings in the background are the so-called, the taller ones, the Morocco Factory. The Morocco Factory took goat skin, sheepskin, tanned it, and made shoes and gloves out of it. There are two trains in this picture. The one on the turntable to the right is being turned around. And by the way, they usually kept an extra engine in the South Acton engine house in the event of something breaking down. So apparently they even had it back then. The engine on the left-hand side is just east of the trestle, which has now been totally replaced. But this was a wooden trestle when you think about it, and these things weighed 100 ton or more. So it took a lot of weight. There were a couple of passes where you could get off and let another engine go by, but it was, by and large, a very busy area.
Right. So this turntable right here is just the Assabet River Rail Trail is just here. You can see it now that the leaves are off the trees and everything. And this is a foundation of one of the buildings that I took pictures of right near the rail trail. And the rail trail is pretty much right here going down to Hudson. So West Acton. West Acton wasn't really much of anything other than a nice crossroads between Arlington Street, Route 111 here, and Central. It was considered the west part of town, and it used to be called Horsepower Village because I guess during the railroad when it first came through, they had a horse-powered log cutting operation for wood for the boilers of the engines. There was an interesting story that for a while it was the end of the line as they continued to build out towards Littleton. The end of the line was supposed to be in Boxborough, but just like the folks in Acton Center, a lot of people did not want the railroad there. They were obviously concerned about the noise, the soot, the danger of fires from the embers flying out. And so for a while, right here, this is north, this is south, was the terminus. And this gives a little more detail of what it looked like in this little triangular area. You had the station right here, and you had a series of yards going off to businesses and sidings. And it really made this town right here, this section of town. And I'll let Bill jump in terms of the stories of West Acton.
As far as West Acton was concerned, it also, besides being called Horsepower Village, they built a number of interesting business there. Milk was the big commodity, shipping it into Boston, and it gave the farmers from the surrounding towns a place to bring the milk to. in the top picture, the buildings, the station is there, but behind that were cars to put the milk in, and then they would just ship it into Boston. In the lower right-hand picture, that picture is taken from Arlington Street, probably in front of what was called Moods, or the other place that was there was Savory Lane. But anyway, here's a yard crew rebuilding one of the sidings. And again, West Acton has tracks going in different directions. So it became somewhat complicated. If the area got to the point where it got built up, and in 1913, they had a huge fire that leveled a good deal of it. After that, it rebuilt, but it wasn't quite as congested. This picture really doesn't give it justice as to what actually happened there, because the whole area just grew up over time. The station was also quite busy from the standpoint of West Acton traffic, but Boxborough and Littleton people used it. And there's the way it looks today.
Right, so the station was right about here.
Yeah. Now, London Pizzas today is to the right where the station once was. But again, look at there's nothing there for tracks.
Yeah. So that's the Fitchburg line. So meanwhile, right after the Fitchburg line, the folks in East Acton, specifically, Weatherby, who had a variety of mills there around where Icehouse Pond on Concord Street, crosses near Bursaw's, they started lobbying for something for East Acton. The Civil War pretty much put most of the building of railroads in New England on hold. But right after that, they continued as the Framingham and Lowell, initially called the Lowell and Framingham. This seems to happen all the time. The Mass Central was called the Central Mass. I guess the number of organizational turnovers and acquisitions and leases by other companies, it's so complicated and amazing in New England how these different railroad charters and the politics of acquisitions and leasing developed. Incredibly complicated. But in any case, again, they tried to push that through Rocky Guzzle, and that failed. And later, Daniel Weatherby was able to support the Dunstable to Concord, which became the Nashua, Acton, and Boston Railroad. And by 1871, and then soon after that, two railroads basically shared the same roadbed going up on what's now the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail. So the Framingham and Lowell was meant to open up the Lowell mills down to the Framingham Junction as well as the Mass Central Junction. And it went through, and right now you can see through the rail trail, it started in Lowell, went through Chelmsford, Carlisle, Westford, Acton, Concord, Sudbury, and then Framingham. Sudbury is going to be building out their part of it soon, and they hope to get to Framingham. And over time, a variety of mergers left the line in the hands of CSX and the freight trades. So this is an interesting map. I'll try to explain it of what, if you look here, this is Route 2A. This was the East Acton Village Green, this little triangle here. You have Icehouse Pond, Concord Street, and a canal that Weatherby had essentially had dug as a raceway to essentially channel water into his grist mill and his plaster mills. And when Bursaw essentially bought this land, the old mill here was demolished and they filled this area in. Right now, this was originally a forge in the early 1700s. Later, Joseph Robbins of the Robbins family in East Acton, of the Battle of the Old North Bridge, and he was the first person notified in Acton that the British were coming. He sold his sawmill again to Weatherby. Weatherby pretty much owned this area of East Acton. And this is still a house. You've probably seen it as you drive by Concord Street. It used to be a hydroelectric plant, but there's a house right on the side here. And here's a shot of old East Acton Village Green, and I'll let Bill jump in to talk about East Acton.
Thank you. The train station at East Acton, we do not have a photograph of. The building that you see, the lower left, was the freight station. And it was moved there after a arsonist burned the train station in the 1870s. He robbed it, then burned the thing, and he was involved in some other problems around town, but nevertheless, we have never seen a picture of the thing. Also in East Acton, there was the train station. There was also a water tank with a windmill that kept the tank filled with water. Probably was quite a problem for the people who took care of the crossing, but nevertheless, keeping it full of water. And the in the lower right-hand corner is the common itself, and it is still pretty much there. It could change some in 1940 due to a layout of the roadway, and it took a good deal of it. They put more of a curve in it to slow down the traffic.
Right. So just to orient you, this is Great Road, Route 2A here. This is Concord, and this is Bursaw's.
Yeah. A separate view of the station, and basically it never really developed that much, even though it was a fairly busy line for the New Haven. But as far as Acton was concerned, it wasn't. There were two sets of tracks there, and the Acton, Boston, and Nashua branch never did that much business.
Right. And the interesting thing is this telephone pole is still there. So if you walk down the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail right at the intersection of Concord, look off to your right near Ice House Pond, and you'll see this is still there.
And another view of it, the tracks to the right, the Framingham Lowell, those to the left, the Acton Nashua Boston branch. And at times they shared the track in places, other times they did not. Acton's big commodity up in North Acton was the granite works. North Acton Granite later became the Acton Monument Company. And this is the North Acton Station.
Oh.
Top left is the station. These are both postcards, by the way, but the lower right is the more familiar view looking down the tracks towards Harris's Monument Works. The house on the background, it was where
we're missing the pictures.
Where Mrs. Harris lived. This was all their property. And Harris Street formerly was called Depot Street. It was busy for a short time. It is still there, but it's this now inaccessible because of the rail trail.
Let's see. So this, Bill can give some background on the story of this map, but this shows where at the North Station, North Acton Station, the Nashua, Acton, and Boston went off to the northwest, and Framingham and Lowell went northeast up to Lowell. And there isn't a lot left of this pathway. It's pretty hard to figure out where this line was. There's parts of the railroad roadbed up in Westford that you can still walk as a rail trail, but for the most part, there isn't an awful lot left on this one.
That's the one that goes over the Stone Arch Bridge in Westford.
That's right. That's right.
Yes, it is. This map was drawn by Henry Scarlett. Scarlett actually worked for a time for the railroad and became very familiar with this whole thing through his interest in history. He grew up I believe in Tingsboro. He ended up eventually living over in Acton on Isaac Davis Way, but nevertheless around 1960, he drew these maps along with another fellow to give his perspective of the 1890 Tuttle map, which we knew had some inaccuracies to it. Turned out that Scarlett and Reuben Reed added in a whole bunch more people into these maps than Tuttle had done, and they were actually a lot more accurate to what is in the context of the map.
So the Nashua, Acton, and Boston, I think someone mentioned this incredible piece of masonry, the arch bridge here. So it started up in Nashua. It went down through Dunstable, just kind of nipped through Groton, Westford, and into Acton. A very rural line. They never really got a lot of passenger traffic there. It was really just to connect up to Nashua, which was a competitor of Lowell as far as the mills up there. So it came in around a little after the Framingham and Lowell in 1873. It was shut down in terms of passenger and freight traffic in 26, and then pretty much abandoned. It was called the Red Line because it continually lost money. I don't think it ever made any money while it was open. It was about the same length as the Framingham and Lowell, which was 26 miles. This was 24, and they both terminated in West Concord. The interesting thing about this line was that originally it went from Nashua and stopped at North Acton. At that point, Framingham and Lowell had the roadbed, and the people that were part of the Nashua, Acton, and Boston managed to get the legislature to require the Framingham and Lowell to build them a set of tracks along their tracks from North Acton down to West Concord. How they did that, I don't know. I think they paid $300 a month to lease those, but they managed to get the Framingham and Lowell crews to actually do the road maintenance on that way. So there's obviously a great story there somewhere, but and so again, this was a line that permitted folks in Acton to bypass going to Boston because they could either pick up the Framingham and Lowell I'm sorry, they could pick up the Fitchburg and go west, or they could go south to Fall River and Providence and eventually pick up the line to New York down there. And this is just a little more information about how they managed to grab their own tracks on the right-of-way of the Framingham and Lowell. And for a while, it was the north-south route for people vacationing up in New Hampshire. You could pick up these great tourist trains, you know, for skiing or for summer vacationing right in Acton. The West Concord prison that started off in 1878 was a major boon to the economy of East Acton, in the sense that a line from the Middlesex Central from Concord to the reformatory was built, and then it was extended to an area that we'll talk about called Reformatory Junction that didn't actually connect to the Framingham and Lowell and Nashua, Acton, and Boston, but it connected up to it as a separate siding. So people that wanted to change had to get off of one train and get onto another train. But this brought yet another line, not into Acton itself, because it was in Concord. So as I said, this was an extension of the Middlesex Central Railroad to serve the prison. It, like a lot of these lines, it ended service in 1926, and the freight service ended in 62. I think that the Framingham and Lowell continued with freight up to that lumber yard around Main Street in like 82, was it, Bill, that they finally?
Yeah, yeah, Rex Lumber.
Yeah.
Wix.
Yeah. So Middlesex Junction, or what they called Reformatory Junction, was a real mystery for a long time. People could not figure out where this was. And again, this connected the Middlesex Central Reformatory line, which is now, I think, a rail trail, to the Nashua, Acton, and Framingham and Lowell branch. It's actually located, some people did some research on this. It's located just below the bridge of the old Framingham and Lowell as it crosses Route 2 south and then crosses the Neshoba Brook. There's a bridge there and a flat area, probably about 100 yards. And this is where the line for the Middlesex Central ended, and people could get off and change trains. But obviously it wasn't terribly successful because it was a fairly complicated way to have to come up to Boston, change in Bedford, get over to this connection, and then go north. This is the only map that kind of teases a location. If you can imagine here, which is the Middlesex Central, here's the prison. It came in front of the prison. This is where the Rotary is right now. And then went off really as Route 2. So somewhere around here, you can see that the Framingham and Lowell, Nashua, Acton, Boston, coming out of West Concord or Concord Junction. So wherever these two intersect, right about here is where this mystery intersection was. You have any thoughts on that one, Bill?
Yeah, the mystery intersection today is fairly easy to find because the tracks went right up alongside Route 111, which later became Route 2. And it's on the left-hand side between Route 2 and the fields. There's a pile of rocks at a height, and I think the pile of rocks indicates the waiting station. It's an imaginary thing, but it's out there. And there's a street in Concord, just the Boston side of the State Police called Assabet Ave. That's the way the tracks came in. Also, the tracks at one point went through Concord Reformatory so they could bring in loads of coal to run the generators. I don't know how the reformatory today is illuminated. They used to burn coal, and they were still burning coal there in the 1970s. So there was a line that went right straight through. Later years, they did away with the front entry, I suppose, and just brought coal cars in through the back entry and into the courtyard where it was brought into the generator.
Right. So
today
here's the branch Bill's talking about here.
Yeah. Today, it's all steam, and I don't know what the fuel power is, but I do know that they still heat the place with steam. It was cheaper than converting over to something else. I do not know too much more about it other than that the Middlesex Hotel was where the state police station is today. That was in one of the earlier pictures.
Let's see.
Yeah, that building right there.
Yeah. Okay, so the railroads basically by the mid-20s, as far as passenger service, with the exception of the Fitchburg line, were gone. They clearly had overbuilt. There was a bubble. It's amazing to see towns like Essex, Massachusetts, which I think had 3 or 4 railroads in it. It was a very speculative environment. And when automobiles came around in the late teens, early 20s, and trucking companies came and county roads had been built and the mail contracts went to the trucking companies, that was pretty much the end of it. These are 2 interesting letters which we found in the Historical Society's archives. The one on the left is dated April 26th, and they're basically saying that by April 30th, not a lot of notice, they're discontinuing all train service on the Framingham and Lowell. And on the right, the Nashua, Acton, and Boston posting was May 13th on 1925, saying that on May 30th, 1925, all service on the Nashua, Acton, and Boston branch would be terminated. So that was the end of that. However, what we now have from it was a series of wonderful rail trails. So you have the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail down here. Hopefully it'll make it all the way to Framingham. You've got the Assabet River Rail Trail to Marlborough. This is the Minuteman Rail Trail that goes up to Bedford, and then the Reformatory line. And as you can see, if they could just somehow do a little bit of connection here, and I believe they are planning on extending the Reformatory line, and maybe they can do something with Assabet either on roads, not sure how, but this is the legacy of railroads in Acton. So at this point, feel free to unmute, and Bill will take any questions that you have. See if you can stump Bill. No one's ever done it before.
I think that's easy.